This is an overview of the Apocalypse of 3rd Baruch, issues in its interpretation and scholarship. In the Gospels, Jesus warns Jerusalem time and time again that their city and temple are in imminent danger. He says, "You see all these buildings, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Unfortunately, this dark forecast came true in 70 AD when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. The Apocalypse of 3rd Baruch shows us how at least one Jewish community responded to this unthinkable loss. But first we must briefly discuss the issue of manuscripts, or the handwritten copies of 3rd Baruch that have survived into the present. The initial text was written at the end of the 1st century or perhaps at the beginning of the 2nd. The story was copied and recopied until around the 12th century a certain copy became the Vorlage, or the basis for two different branches of transmission. On the Greek side, we have two manuscripts from the 15th and 16th centuries. On the Slavonic side, we have three families of manuscripts that are housed in various places such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev in Ukraine. The earliest copies, L and S, go back to the 13th century. Long story short, since we don't have any surviving manuscripts within 1,000 years of the original composition, and since there are a number of differences between the Greek and Slavonic manuscripts that we do have, textual critics have a hard time restoring the text with perfect accuracy. So at various points of this presentation, I'll tell you what the Greek version says, and I'll also tell you what the Slavonic version says. Generally, however, I favor the Greek version of the story. The author of 3rd Baruch, especially if we read it in the Greek version, though this is true for the Slavonic version to a degree as well, is concerned with leading his community out of a cycle of depression and sadness onset by the destruction of Jerusalem. The book begins by the protagonist praying and mourning over Jerusalem, and then the angel shows up and strongly rebukes him. Look at the language. "Do not concern yourself so much over the salvation of Jerusalem. The angel said to me, 'Cease irritating God, and I will disclose to you other mysteries greater than these.'" And so this is so shocking that praying over the loss of Jerusalem is depicted here as something that is irritating to God. "May God add to me punishment on the day of judgment if I speak of it in the future." And so after he makes this concession, then the angel is willing to show him revelations. So consider how different this is from Psalm 137, which said, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill, let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth." As we will see, the community's mourning isn't associated with more and more piety from the author's point of view, but with alcoholism, depression, and family disintegration, which are understandable responses to the plights that overtook the Jewish people in the late 1st century. All of those things will be evidenced throughout the pages of the book. The angel comes and takes Baruch to give him a tour of heaven because he has agreed to stop mourning over Jerusalem. We begin right away to get a sense of what scholars are talking about concerning the physical, mundane nature of the book. Everything can be measured. The distance to the door is 30 days' journey. The thickness of the door is 30 days' journey. The door of the second heaven is 60 days' journey. Hades is as far as 300 men can throw a stone. Heavenly beings have bodies that are sustained by eating and drinking. The release of excrement takes place in heaven. The dead arrive there in their flesh, and upper and lower worlds are united into one physical system. So things in heaven are often explained in terms of incredible dimensions that seem to possess little symbolic value or meaning other than just conveying to the reader the sense that things are very big. And there was an article published in the Journal of the Pseudepigrapha that suggests that traveling in 3rd Baruch is horizontal, not vertical, as he's going through the heavens. So in most of the book, you don't get the sense like Baruch is moving upward. This begins with the entrance into the first heaven. To get there, they travel across the water and through a door in the firmament. They don't travel upward. And there's also a moment in the book where Baruch can see one of the heavens that he's already passed through, which leads some scholars like Alexander Kulik to believe that it's just a horizontal travel and he's looking back behind him at the place where he's already been. However, the same thing happens in the Apocalypse of Abraham, so I'm not sure this sticks. Nevertheless, the book doesn't really give you the sense that he's traveling upward, and it may in fact be the case that this is a horizontal journey. In the first heaven it says, quote, "And he showed me a plain within the heaven, and there were men dwelling on it with faces of cattle, and horns of deer, and feet of goats, and loins of sheep. This is the curse of those who built the Tower of Babel, so that they could make war against heaven." Now I could not find any artwork with cattle faces, deer antlers, goat feet, and sheep loins, so sadly I tried to build my own composite using copy and paste. And as you can see, I only have very modest gifting when it comes to this sort of thing. But why this very particular combination of animals? They clearly aren't meant to be visually stunning like the hybrid locusts of Revelation 9, so what's the point? In Deuteronomy 14, this exact combination of animals occurs together as clean animals, acceptable for eating. So why clean animals? It could be that they are indicated as food items for the serpent in an upcoming vision who eats the wicked of Hades. Still, it isn't entirely clear why a serpent would need to eat clean. Perhaps the author just didn't intend us to get that technical when it comes to the serpent. Maybe he just wants us to know that these guys are food and to leave it at that. Nevertheless, the author makes those who planned the tower out to be really bad dudes. There is a story of how they make a pregnant woman gather bricks, and when she gives birth on the job, they don't let her rest. She has to wrap her baby in her skirt and keep making bricks, right? So it's a strange story, and it's clearly influenced by the motifs of the Exodus, in which the Israelites had to make bricks, and the women in particular suffered a threat against their young. Now, is there a polemic against the books of Enoch? Richard Bauckham says that there is, and that's why our prophet is Baruch instead of Enoch, and why there's so much focus on the early chapters of Genesis, but no mention of the Watchers. He thinks by mentioning the sins of Adam and the humans who built the tower, this author wants to place the blame for the evil state of the world more squarely on humanity. He takes issue with Enoch blaming angels more than people, and that's why we get two groups of human builders, says Bauckham, instead of two groups of angelic watchers, as in 2nd Enoch. But it is unlikely that 3rd Baruch is polemicizing against the Enochian tradition. In fact, the author likely conceives of the tower builders as the giant offspring of the Watchers. The equation between the giants and the tower builders is a well-attested idea at the time. For example, Alexander Polyester, from the first half of the 1st century BC, states plainly that Babylon was founded by some giants who escaped the flood. Quote, "They were giants, and they built the tower well known in history." Also, Nimrod, the founder of Babylon in the biblical account, is called a giant in the Septuagint version of Genesis. And in teaching the tower episode, Philo borrows from the Odyssey, in which two giants tried to build a mountain to reach heaven. Now, if this is the line of thinking in 3rd Baruch, then the fixation on the builders is a fixation on the children of the Watchers, and as such is a complement to the Enochian tradition, not a polemic against it. We looked at the first party who helped to build the tower so that they could make war against heaven, and they were turned into clean animals. There is a second group examined, who are the ones who plot the tower's construction because they want to see what heaven is made of, and they are struck with blindness and confusion of languages. Now, broadly speaking, this tradition of dividing up the tower builders into different parties and attributing to each party a different motive for building the tower, and then giving each party a different punishment, shows up in the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. In Tractate Sanhedrin, there are 3 parties mentioned. And notice that the third party, at line G, wants to make war against heaven. And their punishment in line I is to be turned into apes, spirits, devils, and night demons. So very similar to our group of builders in 3rd Baruch. So multiple parties with different motives and different punishments appears to have been a favorite way to tell the Tower of Babel story in ancient Judaism, even though each telling could take on divergent forms and details. In the Greek version, Baruch is shown a plain and a serpent who appears to be stone. He devours the wicked, and Hades is in his belly. The Slavonic version is a little more confused. The setting at first is a plain, and then it says that the serpent is up on a mountain. Well, since the serpent drinks from the waters that are down below, well, what is he doing up on a mountain? Our author is going to attempt to resolve the conundrum from Ecclesiastes 1:7, and the question is, all the streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. So why doesn't it fill up and spill over onto the continents? Now for Baruch, it's because the dragon drinks about 1 cubit from the sea every day, and yet the sea is never diminished. Baruch said, and how is that? And the angel said, listen, the Lord God made 360 rivers. Now this appears to be a gematria riddle that requires the transliteration of the Greek word dragon into Hebrew before counting. And dragon has a numerical value of 360, and thus the balance of the hydraulic cycle is established. The input of 360 rivers equals the output of the 360 dragon who is drinking from the sea. And as a result of the equilibrium of the two 360s, the sea remains stable. So here, even though the dragon is a dark creature and associated with the deep, he still plays a positive role in establishing order, as opposed to simply the traditional image of the dragon personifying the forces of death and chaos. Now, the numerical riddle here doesn't work in Slavonic, because in Slavonic at one moment there are 353 rivers, and in another instance it's 354, and neither one of those would equate with dragon. And so you have to go with the Greek version. Now we arrive at the issue of alcoholism and how this gets linked in with the sin of Adam and Eve. Baruch says, I pray you, show me which is the tree that caused Adam to stray. And the angel said, it is the vine which the angel Samael planted, by which the Lord God became angered. And here the Slavonic is even stronger and more corrective, as though to say, first of all, it's not a tree, it's a vine. Continuing, it says, and he cursed Samael and his planting. For this reason, he did not permit Adam to touch it. So if someone were to ask the question, why did God put a tree or a vine in the Garden of Eden if he didn't want Adam to partake of it? Our author's answer is that God didn't do it. It's the devil who placed it there. And here we really begin to see that this author has some familiarity with the destructive effects of alcohol. He says, quote, men now who insatiably drink the wine deriving from the tree of knowledge, from the vine, transgress worse than Adam, and become distant from the glory of God, and will secure for themselves eternal fire, for no good derives from it. Now he goes on to discuss the disintegration of families due to alcohol, and the book has two vice lists, two lists of really bad sins, and drunkenness appears on both lists. So this is why some scholars think that a component of alcoholism is experienced within Jewish communities who saw their place in the empire, and indeed within God's divine economy, as precarious after the failed Jewish revolt. The rainwaters from the flood wash out the Garden of Eden, allowing Noah to discover a sprig of the vine from the tree of knowledge. He then prays and asks the Lord what he should do with it. In the Slavonic version, and the Lord sent the angel Sarasael, and he declared to him, rise, Noah, and plant the vine, and alter its name, and change it for the better. But beware, Baruch, this tree still possesses evil. So here we can see the attitude toward alcohol becomes ambivalent, but still more on the side of caution. Also, Noah's scene of drunkenness in Genesis is omitted. In its place, we have Noah being prayerful and cautious regarding alcohol. In the Greek version, a Christian interpolation, or an insertion into the original text, can be plainly seen. The angel says, its bitterness will be changed into sweetness, and its curse will become a blessing, and its fruit will become the blood of God. And just as the race of men have been condemned through it, so through Jesus Christ, Emmanuel, in it they will receive a calling and an entrance into paradise. Now, giving the text a Eucharistic slant for a Christian audience is fine as far as it goes, but if you do this sort of thing, you have to do a good editing job. In verse 15, he tells us the fruit of the vine is the blood of God, and then the editor leaves intact verse 16, where we're told that those who drink of the vine have sinned worse than Adam, and they come into eternal fire. So by not editing the text well enough, he's essentially made the Eucharist a passport into hell. So again, as far as editing goes, just not very well done. A number of interesting interpretive moves take place with the Garden of Eden story, one of which involves the famous issue of not touching the fruit. In Genesis 2:17, God says you're not supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge. In Genesis 3:3, Eve quotes God as saying you should not eat from it or touch it. The rabbis took the view that the woman had added this command to build a hedge around God's commandment. This was the point of the oral law. Since it wasn't always clear at what point the written commandment was violated, an oral law was established to ensure the written commandment wouldn't be violated. So, for example, the people of Israel weren't supposed to work or carry a load on the Sabbath. So the authorities built a hedge around this commandment by saying you couldn't even pluck a single head of grain and rub it in your fingers to eat if you were hungry. So Jesus has a conflict with the Pharisees about this very thing in Luke chapter 6. Now, similarly, the rabbis thought that by adding do not touch to the commandment, Eve was trying to build a hedge around God's commandment not to eat the fruit. Because if you don't even touch it, then you definitely won't eat it. But they thought that she simply built too thick of a hedge around the commandment. So they recognized you could go too far with this and make the oral commandment too burdensome. Now, in contrast to the rabbis, Third Baruch's approach to this issue is simple, and it's just to trust the woman's testimony. When the woman says that, we're not supposed to touch it, she's quoting God because God actually said this. Josephus takes this same approach in the first chapter of Antiquities. So they don't make nearly as big of a deal out of this as the rabbis do. They choose to just trust the woman's testimony. We'll come back to Adam and Eve when we discuss the moon, but first let's talk about the flood. So in 3rd Baruch, the express purpose of the flood is to destroy the giants. We have the same thing in the Damascus document, in the Wisdom of Solomon, and in 3rd Maccabees, so it's a common idea. Now 3rd Baruch is interesting because it tells us that exactly 409,000 giants died during the flood. So why this precise number? Again, we need to transliterate it into Hebrew, and the Greek word for flood is cataclysmos, which we would transliterate like this. We get a total of 409. Again, this only works in the Greek version. The Slavonic version gives a different number, 104,000. There is also an unsolved gematria riddle in 3rd Baruch. Earlier it says that the tower was 463 cubits high, and we're not sure what that's referring to. It still hasn't been solved. But again, one more time, in Slavonic, the tower riddle is lost as well because the tower is simply 80,000 cubits high and 520 cubits wide. So it's interesting that it's only in the Greek versions that these mathematical riddles have been preserved. Then Baruch sees the sun and the moon. And the sun is called a man, not an angel, but a man. And he is pulled by 4 horses, which interpreters say is borrowed from Greek mythology, from Helios, the sun god. So even though our writer is Jewish and he maintains monotheism, we still have this influx from Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, the sun is preceded by a phoenix, and in Baruch we have the same thing. But what is interesting about the phoenix here is he's a sort of ozone layer and magnetic field all rolled into one. His wings absorb some of the sun's rays because if he didn't, the sun would burn up the earth. So in this way, the phoenix becomes the earth's guardian. The angels are opening the 365 gates of heaven now, and light is separating itself from darkness. And a voice came saying, Light giver, give splendor to the world. So immediately you'll notice the 365 gates for the sun is like First Enoch. And it's not clear why all the gates had to be opened, since he's not going to go through all the gates every day, but nevertheless. The language of separating light from darkness is meant to recall Genesis 1, when God separated light from dark on the first day of creation. The daily separation of the two means that every morning we see, as it were, a repeat of the creation cycle. Now, the Talmud says this very clearly, that every day God renews the act of creation. And of course, the idea in ancient Judaism that God in some sense continues to create even after the creation week is a conversation that gets evoked in John's Gospel during a Sabbath controversy where Jesus says he continues to work because his Father is still working. Then the phoenix takes a poop, and this is a truly remarkable moment within the book. So the heavenly manna gets eaten by the phoenix, then the phoenix poops, and the poop is a worm, and the worm creates cinnamon, and then the kings of the earth put the cinnamon in their food. Now I've simplified this process with an equation. The poop equals the cinnamon, but there's a few extra steps involved. And it raises a number of important theological questions. Is the poop cinnamon more because it comes from the manna or because it comes from the phoenix? And if it's because it comes from the manna, does this mean that the children of Israel also pooped cinnamon when they wandered in the wilderness, since they were eating the manna? Now, the issue is taken up at length, believe it or not, in Tractate Yoma in the Bavli. There, some rabbis decided that the children of Israel did not poop at all in the wilderness because the manna was perfect for the body and produced no waste. And this raises a number of interpretive problems. For example, this raised the question of how come the law of Moses says to carry a shovel to bury your excrement if there is no pooping because you eat the manna? What's the shovel for? Now, some rabbis said they pooped when they bought food from Gentile merchants. Others said the manna was so strong it even canceled out the poop-creating effects of the food bought from the Gentiles. In fact, in Numbers 11:6, the people say, our soul is dried up, and all we have is this manna to look at. And the rabbis decided this meant that their bowels are dried up because of the manna. And they were afraid that their bodies were not working properly because the manna was keeping them from pooping. So, in 3rd Baruch, the conversation on manna and poop might seem incredibly strange, like a one-off conversation, but we can see in the Talmud that the question of manna and poop was taken very seriously by the rabbis. And on the morrow I saw the moon, also in the form of a woman, seated on a wheeled chariot, and in front of it were oxen and lambs near the chariot, and also many angels. And I said, Lord, what are the oxen and the lambs? And he said to me, these are angels also. Another point of contact with Greek mythology, the moon goddess Selene was a woman who, according to Homer, bathed her lovely body in the waters of the ocean, and she puts on a shining garment, and then she gets with her horses and she travels at full speed. And according to Virgil, Pan was the lover of the moon goddess, and he granted her a herd of lambs. So that is similar here to 3rd Baruch. And other Greek writers said that the oxen pulled Selene's chariot instead of horses, which again is like 3rd Baruch. Now the interesting thing in 3rd Baruch is that the animals are angels, not like the cherubim or the seraphim. They aren't mixed, they're just animals, and yet they're called angels. So this is quite interesting. One of the most fascinating aspects of 3rd Baruch is how the moon is guilty of assisting the devil in the fall. Listen, O Baruch, this which you see was designed by God to be beautiful without peer, that is, the woman who is the moon. And during the transgression of the first Adam, she gave light to Samael when he took the serpent as a garment. And she did not hide, but, on the contrary, waxed, and God was angered with her and diminished her and shortened her days. So the moon gets a bad rep in 3rd Baruch. 3rd Baruch is content to blame the fall on Adam and not Eve, and so you would think that womankind would be off the hook, as it were. But alas, a woman does get blamed, even if we have to get the moon involved. Now, perhaps what is most surprising here is the conclusion that Adam does not fall until nighttime, which would suggest that he falls on the Sabbath instead of on the day he was made. Now, usually efforts were made to avoid placing the fall on the Sabbath. A fall on the 6th day of creation is the way it is, for example, in Tractate Sanhedrin and in the teachings of Rabbi Eliezer. And in Genesis Rabbah, the Sabbath is especially protected as a period of God's grace. There, Rabbi Simeon Bar Judah says that the primordial lights that God made on day 1 continue to shine throughout the creation week and on through the Sabbath. And even though Adam fell on day 6, he was allowed to stay in the garden until the conclusion of Sabbath. So despite being fallen, they get to enjoy the primordial lights and the garden for the first Sabbath, and then after that, they're kicked out for what they did on day 6. So 3rd Baruch is unique in permitting the fall to apparently take place on the Sabbath. No other book does this. Jubilees famously doesn't allow Adam and Eve to enter into the garden until many weeks after they're made, and so Sabbath is safeguarded in that book as well. Then Baruch sees a lake with birds worshiping all around the lake, and the righteous singing in choirs. He says that some of them are crane birds the size of oxen. Now, the versions are divided here. The Slavonic says it is on a mountain that you find this lake, and the Greek says it's a plain. Either one could potentially be the original. Heavenly mountains are known in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, and in 1 Enoch 22 there's a mountain in the west that serves as an abode for the dead. It also has a fountain of water. Now in the Greek version, plains for the afterlife were known to the Greeks in the Elysian fields and the Isles of the Blessed in Homer's Odyssey, and in the second book of the Sibylline Oracles, the Acherusian lake is located in the Elysian plain. So whichever one is original, either one could have made sense. Now the lake, it says, is full of mysteries. One purpose of the lake is to purge. The sun, for example, has to come here and wash his crown every night because the sins of men darken his crown whenever he's on the job. Now, Baruch is also aware that rainwater comes from the ocean, but since ocean water is not potable, it cannot be that ocean water is causing plants to grow in his reasoning. So the author decides that it is the dew from this lake that comes down onto plants at night and whatnot. And when the dew of the heavenly lake descends onto the plants, it acts like a fertilizer, permitting them to grow, since the water dumped out from the ocean in rainwater is not enough to make a plant grow. And from writers such as Aristotle, we know that the ancients were keenly aware of the crane's migration to Africa every year, inducing a swell of birds around the eastern Mediterranean. And there are a lot of birds involved in this. And the largest bird, of course, was the crane. And so this is very much a historically situated reference that the ancient audience would have understood. In the Greek version, it seems that the birds themselves are the souls of righteous dead people. If this is so, there are a ton of parallels with Greek and Egyptian thought, but just to highlight some Jewish resonances, we have places in the Psalms and in Ezekiel where human souls are compared to birds. In the Talmud, it says, "The body is sinned, for since I am separated from it, I fly in the air like a bird," and so on. And so that could inspire this thinking. But in the Slavonic version, the birds are always worshiping, and the souls of the righteous only join them intermittently. The constant worship of the birds may borrow from the theme of creation's praise and obedience to God as an example to humankind, a theme that is well known in the biblical and the Second Temple periods. Throughout the Bible and other ancient writings, we consistently find that animals are considered to be worshiping God just by fulfilling their functions, by doing the things that they were made to do. Jackals and ostriches are said to glorify God just by quenching their thirst with a drink of water. When birds put their young in a nest, they are compared to worshippers laying a gift at the altar in Jerusalem. The deer are like priests in the temple, except their version of temple service is to strip bark off the trees and to declare God's glory. Even non-animate creation is depicted as participating in worshipful gestures, such as when the rivers clap their hands and act normative in settings for worship through music. In Ben Sira, an influential Jewish text from the Apocrypha, the stars are praised not just for obeying the Lord in their cycles and seasons, but for having enough courtesy to refrain from crowding each other out. In Enoch, the stars are obedient when they have a predictable migration pattern, as most stars do. But falling stars and shooting comets are disorderly, and they become the model for fallen angels who don't know their place in God's order. So if the Slavonic version is to be favored here, which seems more likely, then the animals are seen as the model worshippers of heaven, and human beings are worshiping alongside them. Before we get into the last vision, I want to point out the difficulty interpreters have understanding which vision is in which heaven. Whatever approach you take ends up confusing. You can look at the enumeration of heavens, but when you do that, you see in the left column, in the Greek text, you're told about the first, second, third, and fifth heaven, and you're never told about the fourth heaven. In the Slavonic, you're told about the first, second, and fifth heavens. If you go by gates, how many gates does he go through? Well, in the Greek version, you get a gate at the tower builders and at the tower planners, and then at the very end at the fifth heaven. In the Slavonic version, you get 4 gates, the same as in the Greek, but you also get another gate when you come to the stone serpent. And then if you look at journeying, traveling, well, they both have journey narratives for the first 3 visions and then not after that. And so what do? How do you work this out? Clearly, the text has been corrupted at this point, and of course, there have been hypothetical reconstructions. You can see here that I have 5 items laid out. Some have said, well, that must have been the original 5 heavens, but that's just speculative. We don't have any conclusive evidence from the manuscripts themselves. When they arrive at the 5th heaven, they are not allowed in, which is kind of shocking. Rather, the angel Michael meets with 3 parties of angels who are bringing the prayers of men in from the earth. Now, Michael arrives with a very large bowl, its depth so great as from heaven to the earth to receive the prayers of men. And the angels place flowers in the receptacle to represent prayers. Now, the first group has baskets full of flowers, and predictably they get a good response. Take and give 100-fold reward to our friends. Those who sow well harvest well. Interesting, the Greek version here says that Michael dispensed oil, and the Slavonic version says that he dispensed mercy. And that's because the scribe misread the word oil, eleon, as the word mercy, eleos. And so that's understandable. The second group is scared to draw near, but Michael encourages them. And when he sees the baskets are not very full, the Slavonic version says that Michael cries, which kind of reminded me of Revelation 5, where John cries. So this kind of literature is not aversive to depicting people crying in heaven. And, they get rewarded according to their number of flowers. And then the third group shows up blackened by the sins of men and demons, and of course they have no flowers. They've been looking over the wicked, and they beg to be released from their duties. And so Michael goes in the gate, talks to God, comes back out, and tells them that God will not leave even the wicked without angelic attendance. Nevertheless, these angels are instructed to go and pour out plagues and release demons to harm the children of the wicked. Probably the cardinal issue of interpretation in this book is, does Baruch ever see the glory of God? The book makes a big deal out of this. He has promised that he will see the glory of God several times. One view is that of Hilton and Bauckham, that the book is missing its ending. You get no theophany, no scary and glorious encounter with God, because the book is cut short at the fifth heaven, and the book probably had seven heavens. The second view is that of Zingerman, who says, until the end of the apocalypse, Baruch will not see the glory of God himself. It looks as if the angel means here that Baruch will see the splendor of the sunrise, since the heavens declare the glory of God, as in Psalm 19. And the psalm continues with a glorious description of the sunrise. We'll come back to this in a moment. The third view, as in Charlesworth, there seems to be three glories of God in third Baruch. The sunrise, which receives three mentions of glory in both versions, Michael receiving prayers and dispensing rewards, one mention in the Greek and twice in the Slavonic, and the righteous in their resting place, once in the Slavonic. In both versions, the majority of the glory references surround the sunrise, and all of the theophany-like language is associated with the sunrise. Listen, Baruch, everything I have shown you is in the first and second heaven, and in the third heaven the sun passes through and gives splendor to the world. But wait, and you will see the glory of God. And then he goes on to say, I saw the sun gleaming, and with him angels carrying him, and a crown on his head, and we were not able to look directly into this sight and see. And at the same time as the sun shone out, the phoenix spread out its wings. Seeing such glory, I became overcome with a great fear, and fled and hid in the wings of the angel, being overcome by fear and brightness, and either collapsing or fleeing to take refuge. These are the stock tropes of a theophany, of an encounter with the glory of God. So the question is, why does all of this language surround the sunrise? Now, very quickly, these are my axioms for making sense of the sunrise theophany and its relationship to the rest of the book. 1, this community is mourning the loss of Jerusalem and the temple. Based on the way the book opens, this is undeniable, and everybody agrees with this. 2, the audience is worried God won't hear their praise and petitions. If the audience has accepted the narrative that the Jewish people are under God's judgment, and this is why they have lost Jerusalem, this is an understandable concern, and sorrow has become a part of their social and religious lives. 3, the daily cycle of grief begins with morning prayer, which for an audience in Asia Minor or Alexandria would mean facing the sunrise, since European Jews were oriented toward Jerusalem in prayer. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'll just note that Jews praying facing Jerusalem was established very early, back in 1 Kings, and it's well attested in lots of other texts after that, all the way through the book of Daniel. Now, Jewish prayer habits in the first century and in the second century were not uniform. Some sources say that they prayed 3 times a day, morning, day, and night. And other sources, like Josephus, for example, says that Jews prayed in the morning and at night. But wherever you go, whatever source you look at, Jews pray in the morning and they face Jerusalem, which means for European Jews, they're going to be facing the sunrise because they're facing Jerusalem. 4, the author attempts to subvert morning prayer into something more positive using Psalm 19. Instead of thinking about the city's destruction when they face the east to pray every morning, the author uses the sunrise to show his community they still have access to God's glory through the creation. They don't have access to God's glory or the Shekinah in the temple, but God's glory is mediated through the sunrise according to Psalm 19. And as a result of the access to God's glory, he assures his audience that God still does answer their prayers and reward acts of faithfulness. I think this is the whole point of focusing on the glory of God in the sunrise. And I think this makes sense of the book's structure. It's only after the sunrise theophany, that is, after the morning prayer, that you get the accepted prayers of the righteous dead and the birds. And notice that they are praying outside by a lake, just like the sunrise is an outdoor phenomenon. No building, no temple, just the glory of God as it is encountered in the natural world. And when they begin their prayer cycle at sunrise, they should understand that their petitions are accepted, even though they're not in Jerusalem. Just as Michael meets with the angels outside the gate, even though there's no penetration into the city, God still hears and abundantly rewards prayers. The author's community is here set in contrast to those who truly do not have access to heaven, even though they tried to gain access to it, and they did so by planning and building a tower. And notice that they are building people who don't have access to heaven in the earliest parts of the book, as were in the later parts of the book. All the people who have access to God's glory have access to it even though they are outside and they have no building. So in this way, I think morning prayer is the most immediate context for the book, and it's the reason why the glory of God is concentrated on the sunrise, and it's only after the sunrise that the book becomes positive in tone, because even though you don't have the temple and you can't access the glory of God in sacred space, you can still access the glory of God through the creation, and then from that point forward, the entire context of the book is that they are outdoors, and yet they still have interactions with God. And this is probably how the Jews in this book were meeting. They were worshiping outdoors, and they were praying, and they were encountering the sunrise in their morning prayers, and they were the author is trying to get them to stop grieving and to recognize that they have access to the glory of God in the natural world, and God is in fact still hearing their prayers despite the loss of Jerusalem.